Hello and welcome to the third video in our series on fiscal policy. In this third video, we're going to finish up covering the effects of government spending by looking at how government spending affects aggregate demand. So let's get started. We know from national accounts and from our discussion in the first module that aggregate demand is going to be equal to total consumption plus total investment plus total government spending. Remember, this is a closed economy. In module 3 or 4, in module 4, we're going to open the economy. Now, we know that we have a change in government spending. We want to know what the change is going to be on aggregate demand. We're going to focus first on partial equilibrium. That means we're holding prices fixed. In this case, the price we want to hold fixed is the interest rate R. Okay. Now, the total effect of an increase in G on an increase in Y, it's very unclear. The reason is the following. As G goes up, there is more aggregate demand because there is more demand for goods. Now, that means that aggregate demand should go up. Then, as aggregate demand goes up, aggregate income also goes up. And so aggregate consumption should increase because consumers have now more income. But as we just covered in the previous video, an increase in government spending also implies an increase in taxes. So taxes go up as well, which is going to decrease consumption. So what's going to happen? In principle, we don't know, but we can actually figure it out. That's what we're going to do next. So we're going to figure out the effect on aggregate demand by using the change operator. What we want to know here is what's the size of the change in output relative to the change in government spending. The change in government spending will be taken as exogenous, and the variable that we are trying to find out is the change in Y. Okay, what do we know about this? We're holding R fixed because investment depends only on productivity and the interest rate, and neither of those things have changed. Then the change in investment better be zero. And so we can forget about investment for now. Now, the key question here is going to be, how much does consumption change? And the key to answer this question is going to be to focus on the marginal propensity to consume. Remember, the MPC, or marginal propensity to consume, measures how much consumption changes when income changes. And that's exactly the thing we want to know. Because if you remember, and I apologize for going back, the key here is going to be as demand goes up, so does income. And so C increases. By how much? Well, that depends on the marginal propensity to consume. If the consumer has a high marginal propensity to consume, then consumption is going to increase a lot with income. Okay, let's see then how to use that. We know that the change in consumption, it's going to be equal to the marginal propensity to consume times the change in income. Okay, that's going to increase consumption. But we also know that there is going to be higher taxes, and taxes are going to decrease the income of the consumer. And so the consumption change is going to be lower the more these taxes go up. Now, thanks to the discussion we had about the government's budget, we know that this change in taxes has to be equal to the change in government spending. And so this gives us a very nice representation of how much consumption is going to change, where we know that consumption is going to go up because of the higher income, but then it's going to go down because of the higher taxes in proportion to how much government spending is increasing. We can now take all of this together. So the change in demand is going to be the change in consumption plus the change in investment plus the change in government spending. Change in investment is zero, goes away. Now I can replace for the change in consumption. That's MPC times the change in output or the change in demand. That's this term. Minus MPC times the change in G. And if you see, the MPC terms are going to end up canceling with one another. And so the total change in aggregate demand, it's exactly equal to the total change in government spending. That is what we call the fiscal multiplier. how much does aggregate demand change for one additional unit of government spending? In this case, the partial equilibrium fiscal multiplier, it's exactly equal to 1. So what we find out in this economy, in this model that we're writing down, is that there is no additional effect of government spending beyond just how much the government spends, because the consumption effects exactly cancel each other. Yes, there is more consumption because there is more income, but at the same time, there is less consumption because the taxes have to go up. Canceling out those two things gives you that for every dollar that the government has to spend or wants to spend, then aggregate demand is going to go up $1. And that makes for a very limited effect of government spending. Because if you're in a recession and you want the economy to grow, what we're saying is that the government has no multiplication effect. It's just saying the government can increase one-for-one aggregate demand. Now, what's next is to take these to general equilibrium. And that's what we're doing with these graphs. And I know there are a ton of lines here, so let me try to get to them one by one. Let us first just focus on the right-hand side, on this right graph. Let me forget about this. It's not there. Now, first thing we're going to see is there is an aggregate demand Y1 before government spending goes up. When government spending goes up, what we just proved, what we just did in this slide, is saying if you hold the interest rate fixed, then the change in aggregate demand is equal to the change in G. So holding the interest rate fixed, say at a level R1, you're going to move from Y1 all the way to Y1 plus the change in G. We know for a fact that the distance between these 2 points is exactly equal to the change in government spending. And that is true for any horizontal line. A horizontal line here, it's signaling a constant level of interest rate. So for any constant level of interest rate, you are moving, expanding the aggregate demand by exactly the change in G. Now, what's going to happen to aggregate supply? Well, here is where the effect on the consumer's labor supply is going to kick in. We saw in the last video that because of the negative wealth effect of higher taxes, the consumer wanted to increase labor supply. That is this effect, going from the first labor supply to the second labor supply. Now, because the labor supply is now higher at any level of wage, that also means that there is more output. And so all the output supply is going to shift to output supply 2. But we know that regardless of this shift, the new intercept between the two lines, it's going to have to be at a higher level of interest rate than the initial one. Because it has to be at a higher level than the initial one and the demand is downward sloping, we know that this intercept has to be at a change in Y that is lower than the change in G. The only way you could have gotten the full effect of the change in G is by holding fixed the interest rate. But by increasing the interest rate in equilibrium, the net effect in equilibrium on Y, it's going to be lower than the change in G. And this already gives us the main result, which is here. Let me just exactly show it to you. There are many things changes. Aggregate demand expands by exactly the change in G. But aggregate supply also expands because of higher labor supply. Okay, I'm just summarizing what we just did with the graphs. But then, in equilibrium, there are higher interest rates affecting the demand as well. Higher interest rates lowers investment and lowers consumption. Both of them go down. This is the crowding out effect of government spending. Higher government spending, it's going to mean lower consumption and lower investment if the interest rate is going up. And so we see that in equilibrium, the change in output is lower than the change in government spending. So the general equilibrium fiscal multiplier is less than 1. So for every dollar that the government spends, there is actually less than $1 in additional output. And so this is a very contentious issue, because if this is true, then government spending is a very ineffective way of stimulating the aggregate demand in the economy. We saw that the multiplier there was only 1, but once you see it in general equilibrium, it's even worse than that, and the multiplier is less than 1. Now, that requires some discussion, and with this we're going to finish this video and this first set of discussions about government spending. The first thing is, you should know that there is a large literature of economists studying what is the actual level of the fiscal multiplier. It's something that we need more than models, and we need to go to the data to try to measure what this level is. The next thing we need to be very cognizant of is that we have a very simple model of the economy, and we need to understand why in this model the multiplier is low. And it is low because, first, the consumer is perfectly internalizing the effect of additional government spending on taxes. And second, because spending is what's sometimes called in economics wasteful. So let me go through those two things one at a time. In reality, consumers might not be able to internalize the effect on future taxes. So if taxes are not going to come today, but sometime in the future, consumers might not care. And they might actually not crowd out consumption. They might not have that negative wealth effect. This can happen if they have financial constraints. This can happen if they have finite lifespans and taxes are going to go up, but way into the future. And so these are things that might not hold in reality, but tells us something about which features of the model are important to understand the effects we see. Then when we say spending is wasteful in the model, what we mean is that nothing happens because of it. It's just more spending, but like it goes nowhere. In reality, government spending can go to increasing capital by, say, investing in new roads, or increasing productivity by investing in research and innovation, or investing in human capital through education. Government spending can also represent services to people, which give them utility. So concluding from just this model that we shouldn't be using government spending is a mistake. What is the model really teaching us? It's telling us that in the absence of these reasons, the government spending multiplier, it's going to be very low. And so we need to argue why we think that either people aren't internalizing the effect of taxes, or that spending isn't wasteful, and it's actually going to have a larger effect in the economy. One final thing. In reality, prices might not adjust as well as in the model. In particular, during recessions, the interest rate might be fixed. This happens, for example, during recessions where the zero lower bound affects the way that the central bank sets nominal interest rates. And so if interest rates cannot adjust, there is no crowding out. And in the absence of crowding out, the government spending is going to be larger. There is interesting research by different researchers, Gauti Egerstone from Brown, Larry Cristiano from Northwestern, and many others, showing that in times of crisis, when aggregate demand is low and you're at the zero lower bound, meaning that interest rates are also low and constant, the government spending multiplier can be extremely large, on the order of higher than 10. So getting like 10 extra dollars for every dollar that the government will spend. And so there is a lot of debate here, and I want you to be aware of it, but also aware of how we can use the model to get exact predictions of what will happen in the economy if the conditions of the model are met. With that, we finish this video. In the next video, we're going to discuss taxes.